let's just get into it. Mike did obviously a great job summarizing who we are, but just for the 10 seconds that it is, we work with a lot of early stage startups, small businesses. We focus on the business, the finance, and the capital raising. Those are the three areas that we really try and dig into and help move the ball forward along those areas. And of course, if people have questions, great. If not, no worries. We're focused on education today. So let's get right into it. So a quick summary of what we're actually going to be talking about today. First, we're going to be talking about setting the stage for financial models, right? Because just like everything else, not all financial models are created equal, not all have the same weight, not all have the same priority, and understanding the different stages, the different methodologies, the different ways to approaching is going to be important for you to decide your next steps. From there, of course, we'll briefly talk about the different types of models, their various use cases, because of course, knowing the why is so important when you're building the financial models, because what you're doing with a model is not only creating a landscape and a document that lives and breathes for you to make business decisions on, but you're also showing what you believe is reasonable and what your plan is for the business and those you introduce the business to. So seeing those use cases and those practical applications, I think can be very helpful, because what you're trying to do is predict the questions you're going to be asked and then strengthen those areas within your models, within your pitch decks, within whatever it might be. So that way you're ready and waiting, basically. We'll go from there to core tabs and best practices when building your model. We'll talk about some of the key metrics that always get covered in many models, various business models to consider when you're actually looking to build your financial projections. You obviously have to know where you started to get where you're going. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to jump out of PowerPoint. I'll share my screen and we'll dive into an Excel sheet, which basically is a model that we're building for one of our clients. What I wanted to do is I wanted to show you something that's in process. That way you can see it doesn't need to be perfect for it to be valuable. It doesn't need to be 100% specific for you to get a lot of direction from it. And you'll see that there's a lot less to it and a lot more value than originally assumed. And then of course I'll throw my contact info, but of course Mike cost all that, so we should be good. So I started my first presentation on pitch decks with this same slide, highlighting a couple different areas. And I think it's a good place to kind of continue to revisit because, of course, the business model canvas. If you haven't heard of it, I encourage you to Google and watch any 5 to 7 minute video summary of what the business model canvas is and all the value that it provides to startups and small businesses alike. The basic is, this is your business plan in snapshot form. It's the ability for you to plug and play and take basically everything that your business could be and turn it into a chessboard and say, okay, what's where, what's my move, what relies on what. Every single time I make a move, not only does one place get stronger, but another place gets weaker. Every dollar you spend in advertising decreases $1 you have in the reserve. So understanding the different balances that are in play and what you're looking to solve with the financial model, and which of course is the cost structure and the revenue streams primarily, is a really critical way to kind of planning for your business, right? So when you look at your financial models, it's one of those things like, if you're in the med tech world, it's like being HIPAA compliant, meaning you're never going to get a stamp of approval that says you're HIPAA compliant. It's just a question of if you are building in that way. In the same way, a financial model is any sort of financials, of metrics, of math, usually taking the form of Excel is typically the way people do it, or Google Sheets, whatever you're comfortable with, in order to guide your business along a predetermined set of streams, whether that's revenue, investment, expense, hiring. It's basically your plan of attack and how you're going to either raise, utilize, invest capital, whatever it might be. So when you look at the business model canvas and you look at kind of the key focus of what the projection model in particular is looking to solve, it's really focused on getting a sense of what's the story of your revenue streams. And story is really important there. And then what is the necessary information for expenses, right? Because the story is how you're going to make money. And all the necessary back end is basically all the expenses, whether they're variable or fixed, that go to actually you building the business as you want it to be. So when you're looking at the different types of models, there's of course everything under the sun and all of them have their various descriptions. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 2 snapshots. When I think of building a full operating model, and for example, we're having a conversation with a business in Texas that's asking us to build something like this. This is a very involved tens of tabs, which obviously for the data analysts that are probably attending, you're going to not be impressed by that at all. But in financial world, having 10 tabs is definitely something that you're going to take note of because of course you have to understand the flows and whatnot. But the operating model basically breaks down all your financial projections, all of your budget assumptions, and basically your way of measuring your success. It's not good enough to obviously just say our goal is to increase our customer retention or decrease our churn or whatever it might be. We have to show what your aim is, what your benchmarks are, what your goals are, and how you're measuring against them over time. Three of the most common statements and less models, more financial statements that are relevant that typically get built into models such as this are income statements, balance sheets, and cash flow statements. These are the kind of most vanilla flavors of all things financials, and these definitely come much more from the accounting background. What a financial model is designed to do is it's designed to inform you and allow you to make better decisions based off of the finances of the current and future business, right? So what are you doing today? What can you optimize today? What are the realistic assumptions that you need to make today in order to actually give your business the longevity that you desire with it? And also, what are you aiming for tomorrow? And how does that look like at scale? You'll see as you work your way down the operating model, you start getting into number 6, debt pay down schedules. And the reason I throw that there is as your business scales, as you have different access to capital, as you engage a variety of different resources and people, you're likely going to have different capital needs, different assumptions, and more complexity that builds into your model, which goes to the point that this is a living, breathing document that's designed to support your business. Now, when you're starting your model, when you're starting your startup and you're looking for really kind of getting things off the ground, there are 3 areas that I really, really focus on in particular. One is the projection model, which is I want to know how much money I intend on making and how expensive it's going to be. The budget / tracker, which are basically one and the same, which is, okay, now that I have my projections and I'm starting to build or work towards actuals or do whatever it might be, I need to have a simple and efficient way of measuring against it so that every month, every week, every day, whatever it might be, depending on the granularity that's necessary for your business. Of course, if you're looking at a B2B SaaS business, looking at everyday sales, likely not as relevant. Going more weekly or monthly, depending on the volume you're churning, is probably going to be a little bit more material. So small adjustments like that definitely are involved in work like this. And then last but not least, your cash flow. Businesses, it's funny. There's a difference between being rich and being cash rich, right? Jeff Bezos is both, obviously because he's got all his assets, but he's cash and asset rich. But his assets are a majority of his wealth, meaning he owns all that stock in Amazon, right? Now, Amazon's a public company, so his ability to actually liquidate and utilize his wealth is a lot different than most people. But it's no different than a lot of startups where if you have a B2B sales cycle or you have really long cash flow cycles, then you could theoretically be making tens of thousands of dollars a month, but you could also have tens of thousands of dollars of expenses and not have the revenue that's able to offset that in the near term. So understanding where your cash flow is, where it needs to go, what are the minimums that you need to ensure your business can not only stay afloat today, but actually start making progress towards tomorrow, whatever tomorrow is defined as for you, is really critical, because you don't want to see so much success where it's basically like the lottery. It's all the lights and numbers and revenues increasing and sales are increasing. But low and below, the stuff you're not looking at, the expenses, the financials, the recurring churn, are causing problems that otherwise can definitely hurt or at least negatively impact your business in one way or another. So when you're looking at starting your business, those are the 3 that I really encourage you to focus on, because they're going to give you the most bang for your buck. The projection model is going to let you know if there's, and we'll talk more about this, but let you know if it's viable. The budget's going to let you be accountable, and the cash flow is going to keep you safe. It's going to keep you, it's basically the lifeblood of every organization. Use cases. So I like thinking of not just what we have to do with startups, because of course startups, and if you go to our website, you'll see we have something, it's a little checklist, because so much of building a startup is checking the boxes. Do you have a business plan or business model canvas? Do you have a projection model? Do you have the right legal team? Do you understand your pricing strategy? Do you have a marketing methodology and customer acquisition, channel and interviews and different processes taking place? But there's always a why, right? It's never just for the reason, because startups, much like all businesses, have so many interdependencies with each other. A dollar spent in finances affects sales, affects marketing, affects the CEOs, affects the assistant's budget, and everything along the way. So when I look at specifically financial models. And in this case, we're really focusing on the projection portion because that's kind of your first step to really getting the business from in your head to on the, on paper or on the Excel sheet, is business validation, meaning lots of ideas are viable. Most ideas are viable. The example that I always use is the see-through toaster. Very viable, but does it financially work? Is there demand for it? Is there scale for it? Are there operational moats, meaning are there ways that you're going to be able to keep your competition at Heisman length, so that way you're able to actually grow and expand the business in a way that's productive for what you need to get done? That's first and foremost, because if the business doesn't make sense, if the margins don't make sense, or the revenue strategy or the pricing strategy you're looking at don't make sense, you have to start there, because that ultimately is going to be the basis for you understanding what is this business, understanding that 80% of what I assume, from the get-go is going to be wrong, and I'll pivot my way to success that way. What can I get my own initial buy-in where would this pass, the BS test? Would I look at this and go, you want 45% margins on some hard goods, and that the average margins in the industry are like 16%. How do you imagine that works in any way? There are certain BS or sanity check tests, which are always good and really are a critical part of that business validation. Investor pitching, obviously, this is the one that gets the most kind of eye attention for sure. It's definitely the shiniest thing in the shop. But what I will say is, and it's not overrated, because of course, so many startups and so much growth is dependent on the amount of capital you can deploy. So having a proper financial model, it's the number one, without a doubt, this is no exaggeration, the number one thing every single mentor, investor, advisor, motivator, people that run everything from accelerators to incubators say, startups don't know their financials well enough. Because a startup is not just a vision, although the vision is very important. It's all the financials that allow you to get it done. And when you're at the investor step, this is when it becomes all the more apparent, because they obviously, even if you look at, for example, an impact fund, something that's designed to really push for social change, really make an impact in either the local or broader communities, depending on the fund, they still have financial benchmarks. They still can't just throw money out the door and hope that things happen. There are certain metrics, certain thresholds, certain responsibilities that you as the startup, when approaching the investor, need to keep in mind. Example, if your financial model doesn't show a 10x return, then the VC is automatically going to have a question mark on their face. And the reason is, if you've done any kind of sort of research in the startup community and what venture capitalists, what's their why? What are they looking for? You'll find that out of every 10 investments, 50%, 60% fail, right? As all startups do, and that's fine. A handful of them return the amount of money that was invested, and one, maybe two, are the ones that return that 10x, that 100x, whatever it might be. Now you have to understanding that VCs look at startups and go, okay, if I've got 100 startups, 10 of them are potentially going to win. The likelihood of those 10 not showing or not having a clear path to 10x, meaning if they're making $1 million in year one, that over the course of those next 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it might be, they're getting to that 10 million, 20 million, 100 million. They're really seeing that growth and that scale be achieved and look achievable within the model. It can really basically slam the emergency brake on any conversation, because regardless of how much they might believe in the idea, unless there is financial viability, you're doing yourself a disservice, because the investor is definitely going to dock you points on there. So no matter what your idea is, it's one of those things, like one of the beautiful parts about being in the startup world, you learn to be very idea agnostic, meaning unless it's you're selling snow to Eskimos, I'm pretty much always like, well, tell me more, because what do I know about the potential energy generation market? What do I know about potential B2B scale opportunities within this subset of wholesale retail, whatever it might be? But what I always show is, when you tell me your idea, when you tell me what it's going to be, when you show me how it's going to grow, what do the financials, what do the revenues, what do the customer acquisition, the expenses, and the growth look like? Because if those numbers aren't even in the ballpark of reality, then it shows a misalignment of you as the leader, as the CEO, CFO, whatever it might be, not really understanding the market that you're trying to penetrate, right? And of course, there's 100 industries and 100 startups with 1,000 unique stories. But what it ultimately comes down to is the days of pure growth of just saying, oh, I can get 100,000 users or I can get 1,000,000 users is kind of over. Advertising is cheap. Lots of people, we're in the era of audience building, whether you're on Instagram, whether you're on Twitch, whether you're Amplify. The goal is to have an audience where we can engage, where we can support, where we can do different items. Sorry, I got a little trigger on my thing. Where we can do different items in order to actually host and motivate the people that are actually following us. And in that same way, you have to make sure that you keep that in mind, especially as you engage investors who are ultimately going to be taking a hypercritical eye at everything that your business is today and all the plans of what you want it to be over time. Last but not least is business planning. Now, business planning is an interesting one because people look at this flow and they're like, well, wait a minute, shouldn't investor pitching be at the end because you get the capital and then you're rich, right? And I say, well, yeah, you're rich for the first day and then you realize you have bills to pay. And then of course things take a different tone. But business planning is the most critical aspect, I think, of what the financials and the models and the projections and all the builds around it give you. They give you the ability to be an informed executive. I don't care if the business is 6 months old or the business is 60 years old. If you don't have a way to view, understand, analyze, and critique your own business, to find the weak points, to understand the inefficiencies, the chances that the market will find it for you are pretty high. And unfortunately, they're going to tell you via decreases in revenue or via shifting winds in the market and you kind of being the blockbuster of the world, depending on where it goes. So understanding where this money goes, understanding how it validates, understanding how you use it to get capital, and then understanding once you have that capital and once you have that validation, how are you going to use it and execute with it in a way that will actually give your business the best chance of scale, right? Because every startup, no matter how many slam dunks there are in the world, is always a risk. It could be key man risk, meaning you're the only brilliant person and you could get hit by a bus tomorrow, or it could be something as simple as you're working on the startup with your significant other and suddenly they change jobs, you have to move and it falls to the back burner and all of a sudden all the momentum that you had collapses. Building these plans, understanding these targets do so much for actually moving you forward. Let me go to the next slide. Hold on a second. Perfect. So diving a bit more into the specifics around the tabs and best practices. So core tabs that I recommend you put into every model just as a base, because it's a good way to always get started. One, a cover page, because A, you never know who you're going to be presenting it to, and B, a little bit of professionalism never goes, never is a waste, right? Because in the event it rubs that person the right way, it's always a good thing to do. Second is the assumptions tab. It's recommended to pull all your assumptions onto one page. You'll see in the model that I have that we have assumptions scattered throughout because right now this is in development, right? And I've mocked it up so that way it looks, more like a client file as well from the dumbed down one that I picked. And what this ultimately means is as you build, as you say, okay, our revenue's here, our growth is there, our expense growth is here, our margins are there. We can pull all those key drivers, all of those things that you would be toggling in Excel and put them into one central location that allows you to manipulate and adjust the model in a way that allows you to actually understand what's going forward and how you can make quick adjustments. What if we move our retention from 20% to 30%? What if we increase our prices 14% over time? These are all questions that you don't want to struggle to answer. You want the ability to very quickly in the middle of a meeting go, oh, well, I mean, if we increase by 5%, then reasonably we can do X, Y, and Z. Next, you have your projection output, which is, of course, showing the end result of everything that the model contains. In addition, you want to show your revenue and expense builds, which are, of course, the narrative of how you're building your revenue and, of course, the expenses associated with it. Last, you're going to want to have your supporting data, which is, of course, critical to showing all the different background research that you've done. This could be links to IBISWorld. This could be links to Census, Statista, whatever it might be. Best practices. As simple as possible, but as complex as necessary. Meaning, if I, as a layman in your industry, can't understand it, it's probably too complicated. Now, there are certain industries which use a lot of vernacular, like real estate or oil and gas, and you're using kilowatts here and gallons of oil there. And mind you, certain industries are going to necessarily require or rely on some level of understanding, and that's fine. But can the average person, if you gave them a thesaurus or a dictionary of those 10 words that they need to understand, if they really got that picture, can they understand what the model means, what it's telling it? And my phrase is, can I read it? Meaning, can I scroll down and see the narrative that's taking place in my head? And you'll see what I mean when I show you the model. Defendable assumptions. It's great to say you're going to be worth $1 billion in 2 years. That's fantastic. But unless I believe it, and unless you can defend it, then we're both just wasting our time. So if you're going to build assumptions, if you're going to show that you're going to be aggressive, you have to have a framework. You have to have some rationale. You can't show me that you're going to grow 10x versus somebody else. And then when I look at it and I go, hey, why are you growing 10x? You go, oh, well, that's just the growth we think we can achieve. It's like, okay, well, do you do any market tests? Have you engaged any customers? Have you seen the rate of you completing interviews go up 10%? Because if you can't interview customers that fast, how are you going to sell customers that fast, right? Little things that you don't really think about because you're so focused on the broad, business and growth and scale and startup, sexiness as it is, rather than going, is everything I've written in this financial model not insane? Is it defendable? Do I have links? Do I have references that actually can show that I'm somebody to be taken seriously in a boardroom? And it's a quick side note. Everybody that, especially the investors, they're never just them, right? They're nodes on a network, which means they have friends, they have contacts, they have focuses. So it doesn't matter if you meet an investor at a coffee shop or you meet an investor at a boardroom table, you're always negotiating. You're negotiating with them for their contacts. You're negotiating with them for their capital. You're negotiating with them for their respect. And I know it sounds silly, but by doing the minimum, by checking the boxes, by making sure that you haven't left these little tiny things off the table, you get yourself so much further than the average competition. Because you have to realize, if you skip doing your financial model, right? Or if you skip sanity checking all your assumptions, there is a startup that will, and they're going to beat you. And that's not the best thing, right? And that's not the message you want to send. But what it is it's an encouragement that none of this is complex. None of this requires fancy degrees. All it requires is you sitting there and going, do I really understand it? Or can I find mentors, advisors, consultants, whoever it might be, whatever's in the ecosystem or within your community that can actually help you get it across the line in this way? And then last but not least, this kind of ties in with defendable assumptions, but industry and hiring norms. You should know the industry margins. You should know the industry salaries. You should know that a CEO in a business like this, or the average CEO salary for a startup within the first 5 years, is $64,000 given the geography, because of course geography plays such a huge role. So understanding these, not only the basis on the tab side in terms of what you're building and the lens you're looking at it with, and also building these tabs in these areas in the right way. If you follow these two simple steps, you really can build something that can be simple, usable, and really helpful. So when you're looking at building this model, what are you trying to pull out of it? Obviously, we've talked about revenue streams. We've talked a little bit about cost of sales. We've talked about you need to understand your variable versus your fixed costs, because of course the two are never the same. And you obviously want to maximize your variable cost, or you want to make sure your variable cost doesn't kill you depending on what the variable cost is. And you want to keep that your fixed costs as low as can reasonably expected, understanding that fixed costs will scale over time. You'll, of course, go into your operating expenses. You'll talk about your profitability metrics, because, of course, who doesn't want to know how good of a business you actually intend on being or are aiming to be? Your hiring schedule, your cash flow optics. And the reason I use optics here, it's not only should you know where your cash is, you should be able to see it. Meaning you should never say, oh, I just discovered today that I have 4 months of runway left. It's like, well, your model should have said that 5 months ago, right? Because you looked at the cash flow you had in the bank, you looked at the reserves or whatever it might be that you had available, and you're able to see, okay, I've got optics on my cash flow. And in the model, it looks like, based off of a burn rate of $10,000 a month, I've got $120,000 in the bank. okay, I need to start figuring out what my next steps are going to be, especially if I want to increase my marketing expense over the year or whatever the consideration might be. And then, of course, last but not least, your KPIs, including your North Star metric, meaning you should know in the model whether or not you're successful. And you should build in, and what I mean by that is if Uber's model doesn't include the amount of bookings confirmed, right? Because Uber's got two sides. They've got the amount of drivers and the amount of, drive buyers, right? And the singular metric for them would be to unify it, which is rides booked, right? So in the same way, if you can find that unifying metric, whether it's a marketplace or a sale or an LOI, if you're building rocket ships from, somebody, those KPIs, those North Star metrics, or whatever the metrics are that you deem the most relevant to your story, because of course, nothing's cookie cutter, but it's one of those history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. In the same way, startups are never copy paste, at least the good ones, but they do have a lot of the same themes. They approach it in the same ways, not because they're not creative, but because they found that this is the most efficient way of doing it. Because you have to realize by the time an investor is dealing with your financial model, by the time investors doing diligence with you, they're starting to invest time and hours and energy. And what they don't want to do is see that the time they're investing is really difficult, right? There's a big difference between spending an hour and getting a full scope of what a model looks like because it was built properly, and sitting there struggling, looking at something that was half built in Google Sheets that has broken links that send you out to supporting, financial metrics. You want to make sure that the process is as, elegant as possible, understanding that building a startup is, of course, a dirty job, no doubt. Let me go to the next one. So business models. There's obviously every business model under the sun, everything from advertising, being an affiliate marketer, selling something on a transactional basis, having subscriptions, you doing e-commerce, whatever it might be. The important thing is to understand this. What is the primary way that you're going to start to make money? And there's two important words there. One is primary and two is start. Because primary means what is the thing you're going to get the most traction on early, right? What are you going to be able to, if you say, if we go business model A, I can't make any money for the first 6 months, or we go business model B, I make money starting day one. There's really no chance that I pick business model A. I'm always going to say, let's start with B and let's figure out how we can work to A over time in order to take a little bit of progress and turn it into a massive amount of progress over time. So figuring out and thinking about, and obviously some businesses, it's very clear. If you're building a SaaS product, then you're on a subscription, software as a service model. If you're building an application that has various tiers, you're going to be more in the freemium scale. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be charging them the same amount as every other freemium model because your value is different. That doesn't mean that you're going to be giving them the same exact value through their SaaS model because you could have e-commerce editions that are purchased on a regular interval or whatever it might be. I've highlighted transactional and usage because these are two that we're going to use in the model, just so you can get a sense of what it looks like to start blending models together and getting a sense of what does this business look like as the cash flow, and the business progresses over the 3 years that we're projecting. So now I'm going to take a quick pause. I'm going to switch over to the financial model and I'm going to share my screen there and we'll go through a quick review of that. So I'm going to try and get through this in the next basically 15 minutes, and then we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for any questions and whatnot. So this model is what I've called Booking Inc. And the reason that I've called it Booking Inc. is because the primary revenue stream is bookings, right? And it's bookings for long-term storage of vehicles, right? So what I've done is I basically dumbed it down, and you'll see this first line. I'm going to read it to you because I do think it's important and it sets the stage. The purpose of this model is to give an overview of potential revenue, expenses, and overall return. So revenue, expenses, and return that Booking Inc. can provide in the first 3 years of operation. This model is not intended to be a measure of financial return, but instead an indicator of a sustainable business model. So when you look at this, that's the lens that you should look at it through. The goal of this is to basically dissect and analyze your business from a financial perspective, not to show that it's the greatest thing under the sun. You want to go clinical here to start with, because the sales can be sprinkled on with formatting and references and verbiage on slides. But in the beginning, look at it like you would a doctor, or look at it like you would a mathematician, because the more honest you can be, the better you're going to find yourself. So let's start where we start, which is the assumptions. So here you're going to see a lot of the primary revenue assumptions. We have our lead build, including how much we're going to spend per month, how much we're growing it per month, how many cold calls or how many cold leads are we getting per month, what's our lead acquisition cost, before we start converting anybody. For us, because we're in bookings, we want to obviously understand what's our booking rate and what's our booking rate over time, and does it change? You'll see in this model, we say in the first year, we're going to start at 10% conversion and we're going to shift to 15%, because in theory, we're going to get more efficient over time, right? So and obviously we're making more and more sales as time goes by. So if you couple more sales with a slightly increased conversion, you can get some really, really beneficial effects. And of course, you can see it carries all the way over, and we move to 20% starting in year 3. As we work our way down, you'll see we have the booking details, because of course, not all bookings are created equal. Some are big, some are small, some are medium. So in this scenario, I want to give this an example. An example of this would be if you have 3 different types of primary referral partners, then you should have probably one of them is going to be high. So one of them is going to be low, and one of them is going to be, average. Finding ways to use assumptions and averages and easy numbers for the sake of projections is going to only benefit you. And the reason I say this is because you're never going to be able to accurately predict the future. If you could, you've got other work to do. You're going to be a stock market investor and call it a day. But that's and projecting the future isn't necessary in this scenario. What is necessary is making realistic assumptions that show what a potential future could look like. Because once this model's built, and once your supporting models, the operating, the budgets, all these different items I mentioned before are built, you're going to be able to find yourself in a place where you can say, okay, this is our goal. This is what we've achieved. Now let's see what pivots, what adjustments, what actuals can we put in this model that now show us, hey, wait, we're really off on our customer acquisition. It's half as much, or it's double as much, or our word of mouth and our network effects are absolutely taking off. This shouldn't be 30%. This should be 70%, or whatever the specific number might be. We'll scroll down. You'll see the average price of bookings, because of course we have different booking sizes. You'll see we have a secondary revenue stream, which is we're providing fuel for these vehicles as well. So this is on a monthly basis. We have a growth rate. We have a commission per gallon. We obviously have how much we're going to make, because this is a commission play. Taxes, web development, all these different metrics that are and assumptions that are, of course, important for this business. Now, what's our goal? Our goal is to get to this page. Now, this page, obviously, it looks a little bit daunting because there's a lot going on, but the basics. This year, this is kind of our core section that we're going to be focusing on, because this shows us our financial health of the business. And what we have here is basically a mock-up income statement based off the projections, meaning what are our revenues? What are our expenses? Sorry, I grabbed the wrong thing. What are our expenses? And of course, what does this mean for profitability the whole way down? So in this case, we have a gross amount of booking value. We have a booking revenue. We have a fueling revenue, which of course yields a total revenue. We have a cost of sales for the technology and the work that we do. We have general expenses. And of course, these expenses are pretty standard. Everybody's got sales and marketing. Everybody's got sales and marketing salary. Everybody's got general and admin. Everybody's got, general and other expenses, the office and paper and random stuff. So these different items can definitely kind of be very standardized buckets, and you can, of course, bifurcate them over time, all leading down to what are your total expenses, your profit and loss, and of course, your net profit. Now, when you look at this, the knee-jerk reaction is to go, okay, that's a lot of numbers. What does this do for me actually? Well, what this tells me is you're projecting to go 10x in the first 3 years. You're going from 1 million to 10 million. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, you're saying that your growth, year 3 is going to basically be 200%. I wonder if I believe that. You're scrolling down here and you're seeing, okay, year 3 is the first year you're paying taxes. So that means that's the first year you're profitable. I wonder when you started being profitable. Let's go find out. Okay, month 11 of year 2 is the first year we pay taxes. It's the first year where we have a net profit. But because, of course, all these losses, we're still lost money that year. So we still have a capital need. But going into year 3, all this is just good projected revenue, which, of course, is what ended up leading to our year 3 profitability of 400,000? These are the types of questions. These are the types of reference points and conversations that are going to come up, especially as you have investor conversations, that you're going to want to have a quick and easy way for making adjustments for. Now, skipping down, you're going to see the revenue build. And of course, just to tell you the story of the revenue build so you can see, the revenue build is a story of leads, meaning how many people are we actually generating via our marketing, via our cold outreach, via our word of mouth, etc. It's a story of value, which is a question of not only how much are we charging them, but what the value is of our composition. Do we have more large, more small, more medium? It shifts into a story of revenue, which is, okay, now we have all these bookings. What's our commission? What does our revenue look like? And how does that tell the story of what we're supposed to be? It says, oh, you have a secondary revenue stream. And what does this revenue stream look like? How is it built out? Okay, so it's fuel per month. You're charging a commission, that which means you're yielding a gross revenue. And of course, you're going to make half of that in this scenario. So you're making $100 in month 1, for example. And then, of course, the story of what does the revenue look like for your business? What's your percentage? How is it growing? How is it being allocated? And of course, because it's a projection, these assumptions are very smooth, meaning they go up and down in very kind of smooth increments. As actuals get folded in and as actuals get asked about and actually become, real, and you have 3, 6, 9, 12 months of data, you're going to see and if you can look at any company's financial statement, if you download it off Edgar or the SEC or whatnot, you're going to see they're all choppy. They're all rough because, of course, the real world of building a business in the real world, boom, this month right here, this is where COVID starts. So now you can imagine right here, COVID starts. What does that mean for the rest of your business? How does that change your assumptions? How does that change your customer acquisition strategy? These are all questions that people that have good business plans and good financial models, they're of course terrified because of course the world's falling apart and why wouldn't you be? But they go, this isn't a question of if, it's just a question of how. Because if I can figure out how to make up the leads that I had before, and if I can figure out how to generate the revenue that I had before using those leads, then my business isn't changing or it isn't pivoting, it's just adapting. And a business has to adapt in the same way that a financial model has to adapt, a pitch deck has to adapt, and a startup team has to adapt over time. Next, of course, you have your expense build, and you'll see there's a lot of assumptions denoted in blue for all the different positions, everything from the CEO and their salary, working with us and for our conversation, what we're getting paid in this scenario, for the G&A headcount and the different people that we're working with, for the sales teams and how the salaries build, for the operating expenses and how all of this gets cobbled together, for the cost of sales. And of course, what it means in this scenario, cost of sales is one of those metrics and one of those areas that's specific to every business, meaning the cost of you building your business and the cost of sales for you could be very, very different. For this business, because there's so much lead generation and there's web development, the CRM, the web development, and the ongoing expenses that we foresee there are really going to make up the bulk of what our cost of sales look like. General expenses, sales and marketing. And then, of course, I'll skip this in the interest of giving people the time to ask questions. But this is an example of these are all very standard, simple, vanilla tabs that anybody that spent some time and just used their arrow keys and scrolled through would be able to understand and go, okay, I get how this builds. I'm not getting confused. I might not understand why one thing is on top of the other, but I can make sense of it. Here is where in this business, you start to get into some very interesting things where they have a customer, but their customer's only there for 8 months. So this means they have to take into account special considerations of, okay, they're only here for 8 months. So that means my revenue for month 1 and 2, month 1, I only have revenue for month 1, but month 2, I have revenue from month 1 and month 2 of all the people that are joining. And then of course, if they're only around for 8 months, that means at month 9, the revenue that I got in month 1 goes away. So in this way, you have this tiered step, and it's called a waterfall because of course it falls down. But this is one of those added layers of complexity that not only impress investors because this is how they view the world, but also to show a fundamental understanding of what your business looks like. How many models have you seen that don't have something like this? Which is fine, and it's all good if that works for them. But I know in good faith that I can't say a customer's going to be with me forever. I mean, Facebook, I'm sure, assumed lots of people were going to be with them for forever and ever. And how many accounts are getting deleted, over time? So many of my friends and colleagues don't even have Facebooks anymore unless they're using it for business advertising. So this shows in this scenario that my client had a much better vision of what the assumptions around his clientele were going to be than the average person. And investors have noticed, and investors have conversations. They ask, what do you mean this waterfall? What do you mean you're looking at things changing? How does this impact the business as you look at scale? Can you extend the churn? What are the ways that you can do that? Those are much, much, much better questions than, so what do you do again? So what's the commission? You want to avoid those very vanilla, I don't understand your business, but I have to ask some questions because you're sitting in the room with me. You want to lean more into, look at what we've built. Look at what is here on this sheet. And if you take a quick look back, this is a business, right? This is the lifeblood of what a business can be. It's the revenues, it's the expenses, it's all the hiring, it's the timing of people coming on and the payouts of their necessary salaries. And of course, there's tons of other work we've done for this particular client to determine everything from how much equity they're allocating to people, the cost of their service, and everything in between. But from a snapshot perspective, you could make some very critical company decisions based solely off this page. And of course, everybody's intimidated by Excel, but I can assure you, with enough Googling and a few tips, you'll find yourself, easy enough to navigate it. You're going to find that there's infinite ways to extract value just by having a proper understanding of your financials. Because as much there's people like me that love financials because I see it as a tool. I don't love finance for finance. I love what finance enables me to do. It enables me to say, man, you've got a great business with SaaS. What if we could get it out there more? What if you could scale more? All right, let me finance it up and let's figure out what we can do to get you from A to B. That's the thing that I love. It's the reason why I do my job, because I like working with founders and seeing their visions come to life. I mean, it's the American dream, right? To build something great and feel proud of it. So I'm all for it. And these types of documents, as silly and trivial as they might seem, are part of the bedrock of you actually getting there, because it not only shows that you take it serious, but it shows that you're going to have the ability to engage with people that also take it seriously, the investors, the large partners for future expansion, or whatever it might be. So understanding, I talked a lot and I said a whole bunch of things, and I tend to go a little bit all over. What I'll say is this: no matter what your business is, whether it's an ideation stage or you're 3 years in with 400,000 in profits, if you don't have a comfortable and sophisticated understanding of your financials, as much as you reasonably can be expected given where you are, you're doing yourself and your business a disservice. And I highly encourage you to reach out, whether it's to me, to Amplify. I mean, I'm sure they have tons of resources for you, but find a way to not make this a handicap, because it doesn't need to be. And you can get so much more done if you just have this in your toolbox. So with that, I'll pause and I'll toss it to Mike and see if he has any questions or anything that I should go into a little bit more that I may have skipped over. I'm happy to, do whatever works best.
That was awesome, Aaron. Thank you again. I knew that would be a great session, and I honestly think we need more sessions for you to break down each one of those financial statements even further.
I agree.
Compiles all of them, right? Something obviously very important to understand is that you need to really document your assumptions. He's got the assumptions tab, but just as he was mentioning all these potential, COVID approaches or whatever, you taking notes and making comments at the boxes where you make certain changes, or even citing resources that you found that this is the industry average. Citing these sources so that when someone asks, how did you calculate that number, is super important to understand how you did it. A lot of times you might just change number and forget what you came up with, and that doesn't look good. What questions do we have for Aaron? We've got 10 minutes plus. I'll leave the floor to you guys to ask some questions. Looks like someone's posted into the chat. Patrick mentioned sometimes finding and deciding on good assumptions can be the hardest part. Absolutely. Aaron, do you have any insight on how to make good and reasonable assumptions?
Yeah. So the first thing that I do just from the beginning, I don't even do any industry research because typically the people that are building these businesses, they've spent enough time thinking about what they're going to do, how they're going to do it. Unless they're really in, no man or no woman's land, then of course industry research needs to be, the very first thing. But assuming they have a good starting place, what I always do is I start conservative, meaning I start assuming I'm going to do a 5% marketing increase. I start assuming I'm going to do a 1% increase in my expenses or a 1% increase in my customer retention, whatever it might be. And then as soon as have something that looks and feels like a model, the next thing that I do, both with the person that I'm working with and with, just the use of online resources, is look at not only competitors, but also startups in the space, different people that are doing different reports, because obviously every public company has all their records on file. And of course, public companies have advantages that most companies do not. But that being said, there are tons and tons of industry reports, of content. I mean, we're in the content world, right? Where people, whether it's behind a paywall or not behind a paywall, want to give you information. So the two ways that I would recommend starting and coming up with reasonable assumptions are: one, start by doing industry research and understanding who the competitors are and what the typical business model looks like. Meaning, it's not very hard if you Google what are average SaaS business models, right? And what are the average margins? If I click on 3 websites and I see they're between 70 and 90%, I'm not going to put 20%, right? And the reality is, unless you're already making sales, you really don't know what those assumptions are going to be. So if I saw it said 70 to 90%, great. I'm starting with my goal being 80%. And then as soon as I have the rest of the model and everything pictured, then I'm going to go through each of my assumptions, and both from an industry and from an actual, meaning, what I can look up and what I can test myself. I'm going to look to make those assumptions as accurate as I can, understanding that they're never going to be perfect. And the nice thing is, they don't have to be. I like the book East of Eden, and there's a great line: now that you don't have to be perfect, you can be good. And that, I think, should be basically the mindset of all startups in all avenues, especially in their assumptions and their models. It doesn't need to be perfect because it's never going to satisfy everybody, but it does need to be helpful and need to be as accurate and defendable as it can be.
And a side note for the people that are not Excel gurus, always reference your assumptions tab. Don't type in assumptions into your other documents, into your income statements, into your cash flows. Always reference your assumptions tab. That way you only make one change.
100%. And if people have questions, I know of course, we want to keep these sessions so that people can reasonably attend them and not have them be hours and hours long. But if people have questions on their models or putting things together and want to hop on for, 15, 20 minutes and ask me questions that, I didn't address on this, especially as Excel goes, then feel free to send me a message. It's very easy to answer a bit.
Yeah, if anyone wants to put in their email into the chat, I will connect you with Aaron after the session. I know Bridget asked if you're going to be distributing any of these models or templates. I'm sure I can connect Bridget with Aaron. David Conrad mentioned Score has a great model that he's used. Definitely recommending checking out any of the resources that Score has. Thank you for mentioning that, David.
For sure. I encourage you to check out. It's very much at whatever works for you. What I would say is, if you're going to go the technology enabled route, I mean, there's a lot of platforms that offer the ability for you to create models. It's the only caution that I'll give. Investment banks and private equity firms still use Excel. And the reason that they do that is because they understand that they want to control every single reference, every single flow. They want no hidden assumptions, because the scenario is this: oh, we recommended your company should price at $10 because of what the platform said. And the CEO sees the company, goes, the stock was mispriced, it should have been $20. The CEO then approaches the investment bank and says, hey, why is all my stuff wrong? A good answer is not, oh, well, that's what the tech said, right? So that answer isn't an answer that you want to rely on. So if you want to go the tech-enabled route, completely fine, but make sure you really understand not just what the output is, but how they're getting there. do the math in Excel, understand where it's going, understand whatever you need to do, because you don't want to make something that looks good only to not understand it, and therefore it's kind of useless anyway. Because unless you can really be involved, have somebody, whether it's someone on your team, like as you, an individual, a mentor, an advisor, whatever it is, so they can own that and explain it. Just having it there, unfortunately, does little good, because that what's on the page is basically the launch pad for the conversation into each of those different areas. And the financials are, of course, no different.
What other questions do we have for Aaron? Have you seen many 5-year projections from David?
Typically, no. And the reason is this. So unless your business has actuals, doing anything more than 3 years is generally ill-advised, because it's just too hard to predict. If you look at, for example, a power company, if you look at their financial models, they're going to have projections 20, 30, 50 years in the future, because they know what growth looks like. They can adjust things based off population, the very steady state. For very high growth companies, the reason that I like 3 years is because it's the least amount that they'll let you do, which is true, because as a startup, I will be willing to bet in 6 months your business is going to look a little bit different, and therefore your model is going to look a little bit different, and therefore you can imagine one small change today could have massive implications in year 5. So year 5 is very much the tail end of kind of comfort for me. I typically recommend the 3-year model, because in my mind, it's the least offensive guess, understanding that the more years I add, the more I'm just kind of going, sure. I mean, in the math, because by the time you get to year 4 and 5, all you're doing is just dragging your Excel, because you don't know what's really the world's going to look like in 2025. But in 2 years, in 18 months, that's real. You can apply to accelerators. You could have venture capitalists. You could say we have 6 iterations of our release planned of releases to our platform over the next 12 to 18 months. Those are real, tangible things that you can put a fence post around. And for that reason, I try and aim for the minimum, understanding that the minimum is as good as it's going to get, and I can just get further by just being patient with time. So year 1 will become year 2, and year 3 becomes year 4, and look, all of a sudden we're all the closer to 5 years, and we have an MVP built, and things are moving forward.
Well put, Aaron. Yeah, the world is a changing. I think that's a great way of putting it for the 5-year. I mean, it's just too many changes happening to really be able to project that far. Corey Wood mentions, do investors expect financial statements to be prepared by an accountant?
So if you have income, they're going to want to see that your income is being properly documented. So whether that's you using QuickBooks or you paying an accountant, $100 a month to do it. If you have inflows in that way, you definitely need to have proper documentation. Reason being, imagine they give you money. They're going to want to know that you're keeping very, very good and accurate count of where their money is, how much you've spent, what's going on with it, what the use of proceeds, allocation and churn and burn and all those different types of, fancy words mean and look like. Because unless you can kind of show it in the beginning, it's going to be hard to get the trust for them to give you the capital later. That being said, you don't have to go professional. Meaning, if you can YouTube your way to success on QuickBooks and feel comfortable for the first few months, that's fine. But the understanding, of course, is unless you're an accountant or a CPA, or you just feel very comfortable in that space, that's probably not the work you want to be doing. So the sooner you can pay somebody $50 or $100 a month to get that off your plate, all the better. But it's by all means not a day 1 requirement, but it's definitely should be a day 2 thought.
Corey says, same question for projections.
Projections, they don't need to be prepared by an accountant, because the way that it's kind of the finance world works is kind of like this. In the flow, accountants are doing all of the kind of required legal statements, particularly around taxes, right? Your balance sheet, you're going to get your income statements, you're going to get your cash flow statements, but it's much more reporting. Reporting is different than strategic decision making. Now, accountants can do both, and they very often do. They often provide a lot of financial advisory, but it's not their focus. Their focus is, of course, on making sure the statements are legal, ethical. They're not breaking any rules. They're doing everything within the best bounds to help you as much as the law will let them, right? They are typically not charged with, okay, now that you have all these data points, what critical business decision making can you do because of it? That's much more of the financier and kind of where we try to sit in, because I trust that whether a business is pre-revenue or post-revenue, if I get a chance to look at their QuickBooks for, a couple hours and make do, then I can get a sense of what they're supposed to do, where their business could have investment, and what could potentially take place in order to have them, move that ball forward, versus just, have an accountant prepare something that looks good, but ultimately doesn't provide that next step value, right? And mind you, not to say that accountants can't, plenty of accountants can, just a question of, if you're going to go the accountant route, make sure that they're doing more than just outputs, make sure they're advising you. And if you don't have that advisement, or you don't feel comfortable kind of being your own advisor in that way, you need to find somebody to help you. And I encourage mentorship, advisory work. If you're comfortable with consultants, then obviously there's a handful of us that like to do this stuff. So of course, have your conversations, but there's no requirement for sure.
Great answer. Thanks, Aaron. Any last questions? Wonderful. I'm gonna hit stop.
Perfect. Well,